Shadow Hack. Chapter 521, Have Eyes But Can't See Mount Tai. This is a spirit fruit. Yoon-mu glanced at it and was immediately attracted by the red translucent color. He knew that since it had caught the eye of God flowing wind among all the other heavenly materials, it certainly had to have some unique effect. In the origin world, there were spirit plants, spirit herbs as well as spirit fruits, and they all had a thin halo covering their surface. This halo resembled a faint rainbow when illuminated by the sun and could be recognized easily. Ordinary ingredients, treasure ingredients, and spirit ingredients were the three classes used by the people of the origin world to determine their grade. There wasn't a need to speak about ordinary ingredients. They were only effective toward the constitutions of ordinary people under normal circumstances. They also had some basic effect on physical flux experts, but it was far lesser than what ordinary people would gain. Treasure ingredients were already quite valuable. One could not hope to purchase them without at least 300 contribution points. There were even some fabulous treasure ingredients which could reach a 4-digit price in contribution points in the auctions of the origin world. They were like a dream come true for physical and normal flux experts. Even if a great flux expert used them, they would still receiving an outstanding effect. As for spirit ingredients, they were known as the best among cultivators. There was no need to talk about the tremendous effect on flux experts and great flux experts, when even if sage flux experts would use them. If they obtained some and used supplementary herbs to refine them into a pill, the heavenly treasure would increase their cultivation substantially. That being said, the large fruit emitting a faint halo in front of their eyes was the best quality spirit ingredient, since ordinary spirit ingredients wouldn't catch the eye of God flowing wind. Thus, Yoon-mu kept fervently looking at the smooth rosy fruit. It's called flood fruit, and it was kept concealed in a jade box by Black Spirit Valley. God flowing cloud introduced it. Flood fruit? I haven't heard of it. Yoon-mu shook his head. While doing so, he asked the system to search its database, but it didn't find any clues. But less he could find about it, the more expectant Yoon-mu became. Probably the majority of today's cultivators wouldn't have heard about flood fruit because it was used in ancient times. God flowing wind smiled, then continued after a pause. Right now, you know it by the name of red god fruit. Boom. Once Yoon-mu heard the name red god fruit, he felt like he'd been struck by a thunderbolt. Even Li Qinghong, who was listening by his side, couldn't help crying in surprise and forgetting to close her little mouth. Red god fruit. The little thing before them was surprisingly the red god fruit. Yoon-mu felt as if an explosive had detonated near his ear. After all, the red god fruit was extremely famous. It was a legendary object among cultivators. Not only Yoon-mu, but even Li Qinghong was full of incredulity. The legendary red god fruit had surprisingly appeared in front of their eyes in such a mundane place. They had eyes, but they hadn't been able to see Mount Tai. Impossible. It is emitting the spirit halo, so it is only a spirit fruit and not a god fruit. Li Qinghong fiercely shook her head. The three grades of ordinary, treasure, and spirit ingredients were the most commonly known among the cultivators. But there was another grade of ingredients which was better and more domineering than those under the name spirit. It was called God. It wasn't that God ingredients weren't acknowledged by cultivators, but that they were almost extinct and no longer flourishing in the origin world. And the red God fruit belonged to the category of God ingredients. It wasn't a spirit fruit, but a God fruit. According to legend, if ordinary people took a bite of it, then within a single night, their physical strength would cross the threshold of sage flux expert. An ordinary person could join the powerhouses of the world in a single night. Under normal circumstances, how long would this process take? Then how exaggerated was the power of that single bite? The God ingredient was an extinct treasure bestowed only to those who had the favor of heavens. Flood fruit, red God fruit? At this instant, Yoon-mu didn't care about the name. He only wanted to ascertain that it was really the legendary God fruit. There was another question as well, why was such a terrifying treasure hoarded by a third-tier sect occupying a corner of the world? Even if Black Spirit Valley had some unique terrifying secret, they would never have the ability to obtain such an object. If I'm not mistaken, the reason why it's releasing the spirit halo is due to a protective measure. Most people have heard the name Red God Fruit, but how many of the fruits exist in the world? How many cultivators would have been lucky enough to see the genuine thing? After God Flowing Cloud finished speaking, he lightly touched the large red fruit. He used some sort of unknown secret technique, and the next instant, 12-colored mysterious light illuminated a radius of 100 meters around the fruit. This changed the large red fruit, which was originally emitting a faint halo, beyond recognition. After God Flowing Wind used the secret technique, the unique God fruit finally revealed its true colors. If not for God Flowing Wind, they would have probably remained in the dark about it. But at that instant, both Li Yoon-mu and Li Qinghong were convinced of him being right. Because this sort of brilliance couldn't be faked. And the fruit not only produced an extraordinary sight, it even filled the air with an extremely unique odor. The two subconsciously took in a deep breath, but there wasn't any effect. This was because the God fruit kept its inner energy locked firmly so that it didn't scatter. But no effect didn't mean that this sort of God-gifted odor could be neglected. It would make it obvious even to a pig or some brainless livestock that the fruit was extraordinary. If I eat it right now, which level would I reach? Li Yoon-mu had already begun to breathe heavily. In terms of cultivation, you could easily enter the Sage Flux Expert realm, and even reach the middle of it. Given Master Yoon-mu's combat strength which far surpasses that of cultivators at the same realm, your combat prowess would become comparable to that of Great Circle Sage Flux Experts. The 4 layers of classification for Sage Flux Experts in the Origin world were Initial Stage Sage Flux Expert, Mid-Stage Sage Flux Expert, Late-Stage Sage Flux Expert, and Peak Sage Flux Expert. The Great Circle Sage Flux Expert was actually known as Peak Sage Flux Expert. This realm was only one step away from the legendary deity realm. Regardless of where such a person went, they would be considered among the peak existences of the Origin world. If Li Yoon-mu possessed this sort of strength, why would he need to worry about Underworld Serpent or Origin God Sect? After reaching such a height, even the greatest of powers would have apprehensions against offending him. All of a sudden, Li Yoon-mu felt like he was dreaming. I advise you to not get excited early. God Flowing Wind's words splashed a bucket of cold water over Li Yoon-mu's head, extinguishing the wisp of fire which had barely alighted in his heart. Chapter 522, The Sudden Absorption of the Red God Fruit. Li Yoon-mu's heart almost stopped. He was aware that such an enormous heavenly fortune couldn't be absorbed by him without any hitches. As a matter of fact, he already felt that his karma was extremely great. He had obtained the system which in itself was an unfathomably deep fortune. So, what conditions need to be fulfilled to absorb this Red God Fruit? Li Yoon-mu was interested, and so he began to probe for answers. His guess wasn't completely unreasonable because if anyone wanted to use spirit ingredients or something even higher level, they required all sorts of other medicinal ingredients as an additional medicine. What then about a legendary god ingredient which had already gone extinct? Flowing Wind didn't bother with suspense and just said things as they were. Yes, if Master Li Yoon-mu wants to absorb it, you must capture a red god monkey and use its brain to act as an additional medicine which will allow you to absorb all of the red god fruit. Red god monkey. When Li Yoon-mu heard the name, he turned silent. He truly hadn't expected that the effects of the red god fruit were anything more than legends told by the people of the world. Yet in none of them had he heard anything about the fact that he must use the brain of a red god monkey to enjoy the red god fruit. But Li Yoon-mu had heard about a life form such as a red god monkey. Simply put, it was actually the red god fruit's accompanying beast. The creature's lifelong duty was to supply the red god fruit with all the resources it required to mature. Because of that, it wasn't actually classified as a real life form, but rather as a combination of ethereal body and soul. Red god monkeys couldn't influence the real world, and they didn't even possess formidable strength. If any ordinary person knew about the method to capture an ethereal body life form, they could do it without much trouble. However, the reason why red god fruits had gone extinct long ago was actually because of red god monkeys. Once these strange life forms disappeared, red god fruits couldn't escape the same fate. Once Lee Yoon-mu remembered that, he shook his head with a bitter smile. What was this? He had been provided with a chance by the heavens and obtained a supreme treasure which could astonish the origin world, but it was all an enormous joke, a completely wasted opportunity to advance. His circumstances weren't much better than those of the upper echelon of Black Spirit Valley who had taken the god fruit for an unknown spirit fruit and kept in reserve. Lee Yoon-mu was extremely clear that if he looked to capture a red god monkey, it would be a hopeless task. He couldn't be completely certain that red god monkeys had gone extinct, but he definitely wouldn't meet one in a short time or maybe ever. Are there no other ways? Lee Yoon-mu was unwilling to give up. There is, but if you decide to go through with it, you will need to waste resources recklessly. Master Yoon-mu, you can absorb the red god fruit by relying on your constitution, but I can assure you that compared to absorbing it with additional medicine, the efficiency would be lowered by 10 or maybe even more than 100 times. God Flowing Wind sighed with regret. That will do. Compared to holding on to the extravagant hope of finding a red god monkey, it would be better to use it to increase my strength right now. If the effects are lowered, then they are lowered. At least I'll gain something instead of it just sitting in the corner. This was Lee Yoon-mu's decision. It was fortunate that he was a pretty decisive person. As a matter of fact, he wasn't the least bit worried about his strength increasing quickly. It was the contrary, in fact, he wished for his strength to increase as quickly as possible. He lacked time, the long time required to mature. Given his combat strength, each and every iota of increase would imply a lot more chances to survive and greater ability to resist the pressure in the origin world's many powerhouses. Once he thought along these lines, what doubts could hold him back? Given the medicinal efficacy of the red god fruit, an ordinary person could become a sage flux expert in one night. Without the additional medicine, however, it wouldn't be able to display its greatest power. But as long as his constitution was able to draw even a part of the original medicinal power, his strength would increase substantially. After making his decision, Lee Yoon-mu didn't bother with whether it was correct or not. He also didn't care about the aftermath. He only fisted his hands and hardened his heart. This was an important matter. Even if he possessed a god fruit, it wouldn't mean anything if he died with it in his bag. Lee Yoon-mu's thinking was quite thorough. He clasped the red god fruit in his hands and immediately relied on his body's constitution to support as much of the medicinal power as he could. When God Flowing Wind saw this scene, his eyes almost popped out of their sockets. Lee Yoon-mu's decisive action was equal to ruining the fruit in front of his eyes. Master Yoon-mu, you really didn't think it over. If by chance you find a red god monkey later, you could come extremely close to deity realm within a single night, God Flowing Wind said with an aching heart. You don't need to give extra advice. I have already made my decision, for which I can only rely on the strength which I possess right now. Lee Yoon-mu waved his hand, preventing the other party from giving any more advice. The next instant, he raised his head and lifted the red god fruit. He pressed it and opened his mouth to swallow the juice. However, something which caught him off guard happened at that moment. When Lee Yoon-mu had faintly pinched the fruit, he hadn't used his full strength, but he had used the strength of some 40-50 oxen. But even with this, he surprisingly barely left the marks of his 5 fingers on the red god fruit. Dang! The fruit was really worthy of being called a god ingredient nourished by the world. Although it resembled a ripened tomato from earth which was mainly composed of water and pressing, which would be disastrous, it was nothing like that. Lee Yoon-mu had used some 30 tons of power, but he had only left behind some shallow marks. Moreover, they disappeared within a few seconds. Lee Yoon-mu didn't believe that the fruit could resist his strength. The next time, he didn't hold anything back and used his full 162 oxen strength. There was a small Z sound. Li Yoon-mu's finger pressed in deeper, but the thin layer of skin on the surface of the red god fruit was like the most terrifying protective carapace in the world. He couldn't squeeze out even a single drop of juice. Finally, he became even more ruthless, and the great flux energy strength of 3,500 erupted together with 162 oxen physical strength. At that moment, the god fruit surrendered. A single trifling drop of juice fell into Li Yoon-mu's mouth due to gravity. Banga! The next instant, Li Yoon-mu felt that instead of a drop of juice he'd swallowed a drop of some explosive liquid. Berserk energy exploded in his body without any warning or alarm signal. It made Li Yoon-mu realize why flowing wind had reminded him repeatedly to be careful. As for what amount of juice from the red god fruit his body could support, that would depend on the strength of his flesh. Chapter 523, Great Sun Tyrant Body Muscle Marrow Secrets reaches major threshold. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that if the red god fruit had fallen into the hands of a race with innately formidable flesh, like Pangu, it would have been the greatest treasure in the world for them. But unfortunately, this matter was taking place in Li Yoon-mu's heavenly world. Even if Pangu were monitoring him, they wouldn't know that at this instant he recklessly wasting resources to the point that it would make people furious. Just a single drop was like a volcano which had erupted in Li Yoon-mu's body. But how could he be similar to ordinary great flux experts? He had cultivated and used ability points to upgrade many high-level body tempering methods, so how could a trifling drop explode his body? He had an excellent idea, and in an instant, several peak body tempering cultivation methods were unleashed to their peak. Li Yoon-mu went berserk and entered his most formidable state, activating Admiralty Cover, Devil Dragon Bone Refining Secrets, and Great Sun Tyrant Body Muscle Marrow Secrets. He immediately pinched the fruit again and swallowed a second drop, then the third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh. Half a day passed like that without him knowing. Li Yoon-mu's naked upper body had turned red at some point. Under the stupefied gazes of God Flowing Wind and Li Qinghong, he didn't fear that he would explode, ruthlessly swallowing the seventh drop of the red god fruit. As the two of them feared that his body would burst because of the frantic energy, he suddenly began to shine with a bright red light. Bang! A heat wave suddenly burst forth in all directions, with him as the center. Both Li Qinghong or God Flowing Wind, who had recently become able to affect the real world, sensed the power of the majestic heat wave, and their complexions changed immediately. They were forced to retreat. Boom, boom. The first wave of heat was followed by another one. Suddenly, the serene blue sky of the heavenly world was covered by a dazzling red which illuminated the entire place. God Flowing Wind took a look at it and grew scared. The majestic red light drained the color from his face. Ah, 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 ah. As a sun rose into the sky of the heavenly world, God Flowing Wind, which was a soul life form, felt like he was melting. What sort of power was this exactly? It was ferocious and immeasurable. It was a nemesis of the spirit and soul type as well as demonic and sordid life forms. No, if these types of life forms encountered the sun, they wouldn't have the qualifications to be its nemesis. The red sun's bright light was only a warning. At that instant, God Flowing Wind knew that his judgment day had arrived. He would be obliterated right there and then. Even if he was a part of God Undercurrent's soul, he wouldn't be able to resist the brilliance of the predator light. Just when God Flowing Wind felt incomparable despair, the space near his side trembled, and the red light was no more. The entire world instantly calmed down. God Flowing Wind felt that he had been extremely close to meeting the death god and was glad to whoever had saved him. That person was naturally Li Yoon-mu, the master of heavenly world. In his world, the only person who could save anyone was he alone. But the person who had almost completely obliterated his soul was also Li Yoon-mu. What sort of terrifying power had he used exactly? It was the first time that God Flowing Wind had felt true dread from the bottom of his heart towards Li Yoon-mu. Even if Li Yoon-mu hadn't done it intentionally. Boom! At the crucial moment, Li Yoon-mu had moved God Flowing Wind into an independent space, promptly saving his life. After that, the red sun rose above the heavenly world's lands. Once it emitted as much red light as it liked, it returned to blend into Lee Yoon-mu's body. He opened his eye and awakened with pleasant surprise evident on his face. This wasn't without reason. After absorbing the red god fruit's power, his great son Tyrant body muscle marrow secrets had risen from minor threshold to major threshold. What did this imply? It implied that his flesh had reached an unprecedentedly terrifying level and climbed to a new peak. It has to be known that when his cultivation of this body refining cultivation method was at minor threshold, his tyrant body possessed absolute defense against cultivators of the same level. The powerhouses of the origin world were even more terrifying, but after his cultivation had risen to a major threshold, he gained some capital to walk tall among them. The origin world was enormous and immeasurable, and he finally had the capital which removed many of his apprehensions. Apart from that, what caused Lee Yoon-mu to be greatly surprised was the fact that he had ruthlessly absorbed 7 drops of red god fruit. That was right, 7 drops. God Flowing Wind had estimated that with his strength and his body's tolerance, he could barely absorb 2 drops, and that would already be heaven-defying. The entire red god fruit contained 72 drops. If Lee Yoon-mu could forcefully absorb 2 drops, it would be tantamount to absorbing 1/36th part of the energy which could be absorbed with additional medicine. That would have already surpassed God Flowing Wind's estimation of him only being able to take in 1/100th of the energy. But Lee Yoon-mu hadn't only absorbed 1/36th of the effect. Instead, he had absorbed something closer to 1/110th. In other words, just by relying on himself, he had absorbed 1/10th of the medicinal effect of the red god fruit. If this wasn't crazy and heaven-defying, then what was? Lee Yoon-mu's strength had increased considerably based on that, so if this wasn't enough for him to be pleasantly surprised, what would be? But only he was aware that the reason why he had absorbed 7 drops was because of the red sun which he nurtured in his chest. It was the most crucial factor. Coincidentally, the red sun was extremely compatible with the red god fruit's energy. Because of that, his great son Tyrant body muscle marrow secrets had reached a major threshold. System, quickly scan my current strength, Lee Yoon-mu ordered with impatience, unable to wait. He wanted to know what had happened after he had absorbed 5 more drops of the red god fruit compared to what was expected. Which stage had his strength reached? One thing was certain though. If he hadn't dared to be confident in his ability to battle with a genuine sage flux expert before drawing the red god fruit's medicinal power, now he was absolutely sure he could do it. Even if he couldn't obtain the maximum increase in strength provided by the red god fruit, his great son Tyrant body muscle marrow secrets had reached a major threshold. Because of that, he was absolutely certain in giving a sage flux expert a run for their money. Sage flux expert he hadn't expected that there would be one day when he, Lee Yoon-mu, would finally reach this stage, and that it would happen so soon. Chapter 524, The Appearance of Bloodline Power. The system spent a relatively long amount of time in scanning Lee Yoon-mu's body. Only after a while did it reply with a sigh. It truly is miraculous. The system never thought that such a formidable fruit could exist. So? Quickly tell me, how much has my strength increased? Lee Yoon-mu was extremely curious about the effects of the red god fruit or the flood fruit as the god flowing wind called it. It didn't have the slightest effect towards flux energy, but it could substantially transform a person's constitution, allowing them to possess an incredulous amount of strength. Within a night, the fruit could change an ordinary person till they were equal in strength to sage flux experts, and this wasn't just an exaggeration. It provided an explosive boost purely to the physical strength. It wasn't a fruit which would increase one's cultivation, but after consuming it, the person would possess superhuman strength, and their constitution would be substantially upgraded as if they had undergone a genetic mutation. Originally, Lee Yoon-mu had believed that he would only be able to absorb 2 drops of the red god fruit, but he had managed to take in whole 7 of them. At that moment, he really wanted to know the exact increase in his physical strength. Congratulations host, the strength of your flesh has reached 1,535 oxen. In terms of physical strength, your genuine combat strength can be compared to a sage flux expert who had recently broken into this realm. The system didn't sigh this time and just replied in its previous tone, thoroughly describing the extraordinary medicinal effect of the red god fruit. 1,500 oxen, my god! Lee Yoon-mu cried out in surprise. Although he could clearly sense the power surging throughout his physical body, it wasn't the same. When he heard that his physical strength had risen from 160 oxen to 1,500, he was incredulous. He felt as if he was in a dream. It has to be known that if he used his full strength to launch a fist, its offensive power would be at least cross 3,000 tons, or maybe even more. If he kicked with his full strength, then the resulting power would be even more terrifying. The attack's offensive power would reach at least 5,000 tons. In other words, Lee Yoon-mu could definitely cause a mountain to crumble with one kick, given his terrifying strength. If he wasn't a superhuman, what else could he be? There wasn't the least bit exaggeration to this fact. But this was surprisingly not that important. The crucial part was in the system's next words. The substantial increase in your strength is secondary. After the system performed a scan on the body of the host, it found something. Host, your blood vessels as well as the cells have undergone a strengthening transformation. This was the reason why the system had sighed previously about such a miraculous fruit existing in this world. Oh? System, what's the meaning of these words? Lee Yoon-mu hadn't expected that the system wouldn't pay attention to the substantial increase in his strength, would rather care more about the change in his body's constitution. Anyway, it had undergone a tremendous mutation. In simple terms, host, you have gained a bloodline power, the system explained. What? I now possess a bloodline power. Lee Yoon-mu was extremely stunned. Yes. But I haven't received the inheritance of any sort of bloodline. Moreover, with my present cultivation realm, it shouldn't be possible. Lee Yoon-mu calmed down a little. He was absolutely clear that the threshold of receiving a bloodline power in the origin world was stepping into sage flux expert realm. Similarly, even on Earth, the threshold for inheriting a bloodline was stepping into the domain sage realm. It has to be said that although the cultivation systems of the two worlds weren't completely identical, but in terms of strength, they could be easily compared. Both of them required people to cross a certain threshold to be entitled to inheriting bloodline powers. As for the people of desolate continent like Mantian or Coiling Tiger, they could naturally cultivate and absorb the bloodline inheritance, but that was because their innate constitution was special. Otherwise, people of Earth wouldn't have called the residents of desolate continent and people living in the ocean as evolved humans. Despite that, although people like Mantian and Coiling Tiger possessed the advantage of special constitution which allowed them to absorb bloodline inheritance, their cultivation realm was simply too low. Because of that, the quality of the bloodline inheritance which they absorbed was extremely poor. As their strength increased, they would continue to absorb one after another high-level bloodlines which would substitute their precious original bloodline. Lee Yoon-mu clearly understood the difference between the absorbed bloodline inheritance of desolate continents people and a person with a bloodline power as mentioned by the system. What exactly was this difference between bloodline inheritors like Mantian and bloodline possessors which the system mentioned? The difference was that one wasn't formed while the other had already formed. One of them received a bloodline power from other people, which became more formidable depending upon the strength and their body constitution. As for the other, the bloodline power generated from within the body classified people as bloodline possessors. As for Mantian and the others, they could only absorb other people's bloodlines to improve their inheritance. And the system had pointed out that Lee Yoon-mu was a bloodline possessor, which meant that his descendants would inherit his bloodline powers. Thus, the difference between the two was truly great. In any case, Lee Yoon-mu had never even dreamed that after swallowing 7 drops of the red god fruit's juice such enormous changes would occur in his genetic code. He was extremely clear that the blood flowing through his body before was the most ordinary type of human blood without any special properties or any hint of bloodline power. But now, he had successfully turned into a bloodline possessor. If one day he married and had children, then they, and even his grandchildren and even more distant descendants, would automatically inherit it. The only difference would be that the later the generation, the weaker the inherited bloodline power would be. There's no mistake, this was the reason why the system had scanned your body for so long. The system is absolutely certain that you have gained a bloodline power. Although it is very weak right now, it will get enriched as your body grows stronger. Chapter 525, Evolving into a Monster. The system quickly gave an even more detailed explanation about the transformation in Lee Yoon-mu's body. After he heard it, he was speechless for a long time. But the system's words had cleared everything up for him. It could be said that the bloodline which had appeared in his body had already transformed his constitution radically. Even if it wasn't sufficiently dense yet, he still gained enormous benefits from the transformation because of the appearance of bloodline. First, his self-healing had substantially increased. Second, his endurance had also been upgraded by a lot, as well as his vitality, which had transformed to become incomparably tenacious. Moreover, the system also pointed out that the largest transformation because of his bloodline energy was in his perception. Its increase surpassed all that was gained in self-healing, endurance, and vitality. His perception had advanced to the next level because of the bloodline energy. What exactly is happening? According to what I know, there are no people in the extremely long history of the origin world who'd gained an independent bloodline because of consuming the red god fruit. When faced with the sudden enormous benefits, Lee Yoon-mu was pleasantly surprised, but this harvest came out of nowhere and without any reason. Thus, he wasn't too excited. It was analogous to a poor person suddenly waking up and discovering a trunk full of money in his broken house. His first reaction wouldn't be the excitement of becoming wealthy, but a question in regards to that. Apart from making him wealthy, what enormous crisis would the large amount of money bring for them? Lee Yoon-mu was in the exact same situation. Based on the information collected by the system regarding the red god fruit, there indeed hasn't been a single person who had received a bloodline power because of drinking its juice. According to the system's analysis though, the bloodline should have come to be because the great sun inside host's body was compatible with the red god fruit, the system replied after a moment. Although it wasn't completely certain, it was inclined to believe this speculation. Perhaps. Lee Yoon-mu silently nodded. He accepted this sudden transformation, but only because it was in line with his current situation. He hadn't expected that the great sun in his body would surprisingly be such a good fit with the red god fruit. He had no other choice but to accept that an enormous fortune had just dropped into his lap. Lee Yoon-mu then examined his situation again and looked over the latest data compiled by the system after its scan of the series of transformations in his body. According to the data, his constitution had indeed undergone great changes. Whether it was his genes or blood, all of them had been substantially strengthened. It had even led to his own bloodline power. Although it was just recently born and far weaker compared to the ones absorbed and inherited by S.H.A.D.W flux experts, it belonged to him alone. Moreover, it would also mature quickly. At that time, it would not only increase in strength, but would also assist in increasing Lee Yoon-mu's personal strength. Among the specific data of the transformations, which would have amazed anyone, was the increase in his self-healing. Previously, it was 16 times higher than of the ordinary people of Earth based on the data obtained from the system's older scans. These numbers were absolutely normal. After all, Lee Yoon-mu was a flux expert, and his flesh and constitution were more formidable compared to ordinary people. Because of that, the 16 times higher self-healing wasn't something which he found amazing. But the number in the latest scan had made a fierce leap because of his bloodline power. It had swelled to 72. His self-healing had become 72 times greater than that of ordinary people. Lee Yoon-mu subconsciously took out a knife and ruthlessly slashed at his hand. Instantly, a several centimeter long wound appeared and deep red blood began to gush out of it. But in less than 3 seconds, the blood stopped. Within another 20 or so seconds, the several centimeter long wound healed under Lee Yoon-mu's eyes. In another few seconds, even the shallow scar disappeared. At this time, Lee Yoon-mu was completely in awe of his constitution. In almost no time, the wound on the arm had completely disappeared as if the skin had never been cut. During the short time, he had been meticulously obstructing the healing effect of minor reversal, so the healing of the wound was a clear reflection of his body's healing ability. Host needn't be suspicious of his present self-healing. Even if your hair was shaven, within less than half an hour, it would grow out again, the system said with complete certainty. Then could I regrow limbs? Lee Yoon-mu asked, hoping it to be true. It is impossible for the time being, but the system sees it happening in the not-too-distant future. As long as Host's bloodline continues to get enriched, this won't be a difficult matter for your bloodline power. At the very least, if you chopped off your fingers, they would regrow in less than 3 days. Although the system didn't put much emphasis on it, Lee Yoon-mu couldn't remain calm and collected. As a human from Earth, he shouldn't be able to regrow his limbs. Now, he feared that he had thoroughly changed into something inhuman. Naturally, he wasn't an idiot who would really cut off his finger to experiment. Since the system had given him complete assurance of it, there wasn't any need to question it. The substantial increase in self-healing was only one of the advantages. The advancement in his endurance had left Lee Yoon-mu thinking that he was seeing wrong. From 32 times that of ordinary people, it rose to 162. It was way too exaggerated. Thinking from another angle, if Lee Yoon-mu tried to find an ideal companion, an ordinary woman could never conform with his present requirements. His vitality and other aspects had all received a substantial increase as well, but his perception stood out as the most prominent among them. From original 4, it had risen to 16 times that of ordinary people. Although numerically it didn't appear much higher, the increase in perception was the most difficult for cultivators. Its advancement was similar to humans running at full strength. The higher their speed grew, the more difficult it became to raise it. So the increase of 4 times could be considered enormous. Host, it is time for you to give a name to your bloodline power. Chapter 526, Great Sun Flood God Bloodline. Host, it's time for you to give a name to your bloodline power. After a long while, the system reminded Lee Yoon-mu about a significant matter. Why was it significant? Because Lee Yoon-mu had come into possession of a unique bloodline power instead of having inherited it from somewhere else. Just based on the fact that a person possessed a bloodline power which would eternally be classified as their own, they would certainly be able to create a family with an innate bloodline power by relying on it. The successors of this bloodline would ensure that the descendants of Lee Yoon-mu remained prosperous. It was inevitable since the inheritance of a bloodline would allow the person's later generations to possess a superiority against ordinary humans. Naturally, it was far too early to speak of these things. After all, Lee Yoon-mu was only 21 years old. He hadn't even encountered a woman whom he genuinely desired, let alone thought about having children. But the benefits of bloodline power weren't limited to just that. Even if Lee Yoon-mu didn't consider his descendants for the time being, there was a lot more than he could do. Since he would be regarded as a source of bloodline inheritance, he could use it as a foundation to establish an extremely cohesive faction by passing the bloodline power to others. The majority of factions and clans in the origin world chose precisely this second route, or perhaps walked on both of them. After all, because of the bloodline power, the probability of bloodline possessors giving birth to descendants was lower compared to ordinary people. Because of that, few of bloodline possessors possessed a large family with plenty of descendants. Thus, the second route of allowing others to inherit the bloodline was the best choice for creating a powerful faction. Lee Yoon-mu was completely clear about this fact. But presently, he wasn't thinking about it. Given his foundation, the probability of him establishing a formidable faction using the second route was quite minute. When the system reminded him of giving a name to the bloodline power, he blurted out the first thing that came to his mind without much thought. Since this bloodline was formed with the fusion of Great Sun and Flood God fruit, I'll name it Great Sun Flood God Bloodline. Great Sun Flood God, Great Sun Flood God, good, this name is very good. Host, the system has a premonition that your Great Sun Flood God bloodline will someday become a formidable bloodline admired by every high-class expert. Oh? Do you mean like Pangu's bloodline? Lee Yoon-mu laughed, passing it off as a joke. Although the recently appeared Great Sun Flood God bloodline had caused great transformations in his body, Lee Yoon-mu didn't know how formidable it was. After all, there was nothing to compare it with. Since he hadn't tested any other person who had inherited someone else's bloodline, he had no way to make any guess. In any event, the enormous harvest obtained from swallowing the 7 drops of the red god fruit had left him completely satisfied. It seems like I have already obtained a certain amount of strength required to protect myself. Lee Yoon-mu slightly tensed his body and immediately sensed boundless power flowing through it in a steady stream. When he said that he had cultivated a certain amount of strength, it naturally didn't have the simple meaning like something required to just exist in this world. What he meant was that with his present strength, he needn't have too many apprehensions about underworld serpent or origin god sect hunting him. The great flux energy strength of 3,500 in addition to an enormous strength of 1,500 oxen coupled together with the Azure Dragon expert armor was sufficient capital for Lee Yoon-mu to face the origin world. After that, confronting the other matters was simpler. God Flowing Wind had chosen 4 unique treasures. Apart from the sacrifice refining technique and the red god fruit, the third object also wasn't simple. Accurately speaking, it was the most valuable, important, and highest-class treasure map out of the 20-something maps the sect had possessed. When God Flowing Wind had appraised it, he was extremely certain that this secret treasure map held the specific geographical coordinates as well as some details of the surrounding environment of a world space which had yet to be discovered by humans. But the people of Black Spirit Valley had treated it similar to the red god fruit, believing that it was just a map for an undiscovered ordinary dimensional space. This discovery caused Lee Yoon-mu to flush from excitement. A world space which hadn't been discovered by the people of the origin world? What did this mean? It was an enormous resource. Whether he used it for establishing his own faction or finding his bloodline clan, it was an indispensable resource. Otherwise, if a person didn't possess a dimensional space with plenty of resources, how could they create a large faction? Which of the first-tier powers don't possess their own world where they thoroughly developed their strength before attacking the powers of the origin world and establishing their own territory in one fell swoop? That being said, if Lee Yoon-mu wanted to create a first-tier power, he had to possess his own world. At the moment, Lee Yoon-mu possessed many dimensional spaces which included his own heavenly world, the island space where he found the heavenly platform, and the Black Spirit world. Among the 3-dimensional spaces, the heavenly world was his natal world. However, all the above dimensional spaces couldn't compare to a world space. The reason for that? They were small. They didn't have a lot of land, and smaller area meant that the amount of resources was also small. This would restrict future accomplishments. Even though Lee Yoon-mu was extremely excited by the prospect of it, he put the secret treasure map aside after taking a good look at it. The reason was because his present strength and foundation weren't strong enough to accomplish this for the time being. The 4th treasure was a weapon which appeared like a sword yet wasn't a sword. It also looked like a knife, but wasn't a knife. The moment Lee Yoon-mu laid his eyes on it, he wrinkled his brows. He could only sense that this weapon was extremely ordinary. Regardless of whether it was the outer appearance or what he could sense with his perception, there wasn't anything to set it apart from completely ordinary weapons. What sort of uniqueness then did it possess to catch the eye of God Flowing Wind among all the other treasures from the treasury of Black Spirit Valley? There had to be something though. Since it was chosen by God Flowing Wind, it was certainly for a reason which wasn't known to ordinary cultivators. After all, apart from the sacrifice refining method, the upper echelon of Black Spirit Valley had treated the other three treasures as ordinary. Chapter 527, Gambling Everything. In this aspect, Lee Yoon-mu's foresightness was admirable. God-flowing wind might only be a soul which had barely reached the state of influencing the real world, but there was more than physical power to some people. He was very weak, but his soul remembered the experiences of God undercurrent, which made him an extremely precious mountain of knowledge. If it wasn't for his discerning eyes, 3 rare treasures would have definitely slipped past Lee Yoon-mu's hands. And the weapon which was like a knife but not a knife, like a sword yet not a sword would have been one of them. Lee Yoon-mu was convinced that God-flowing wind had definitely discovered some sort of astonishing secret. With a single thought, God-flowing wind was instantly freed from the independent space. "Are you all right?" Lee Yoon-mu asked with concern. "I am fine. If Master Yoon-mu had delayed by another moment, then my little life would have probably been lost," God-flowing wind said with fear and trepidation in his voice. While speaking, he carefully observed the transformation of Lee Yoon-mu's body. The more he observed, the more astounded he became. "You've gained a bloodline power." This discovery scared and surprised God-flowing wind. "Yes, my luck was pretty good. I had previously cultivated a secret technique which was compatible with the red god fruit," Lee Yoon-mu said in a light tone, giving a simple explanation. God-flowing wind turned silent. He could clearly remember the red sun which had risen in the heavenly world. He had never anticipated that Lee Yoon-mu would have cultivated such a technique which he would consider as forbidden. But clearly, Lee Yoon-mu didn't want to speak about it, for the next instant, he pointed towards the weapon lying on the ground. "This, don't tell me this also has some unbelievable origin." Previously, if Lee Yoon-mu had been enchanted by the weapon, God-flowing wind would have definitely flaunted the climax as way to display his superiority over Lee Yoon-mu. But since he had been almost exterminated a moment ago by the red sun which had arisen from the young man's body, things were different. Perhaps even he didn't know, but in his subconsciousness, a hint of reverence towards his master Lee Yoon-mu had taken root. Therefore, he replied without any showing off. "Yes, this sword in stone has a deep origin which could be considered as extreme. It is more valuable than all the other items except for the secret treasure map. I am afraid that even the red god fruit cannot compare to it." "What? So domineering? What sort of origin does it have?" Lee Yoon-mu was quite astonished. It has to be known that the red god fruit was a god ingredient which could allow an ordinary person to obtain the strength of a sage flux expert in a single night. It was something that countless people dreamed of obtaining. God-flowing wind nodded, ascertaining that he wasn't exaggerating, and asked, "I wonder, does Master know about the most formidable race of the origin world?" "Naturally, it's the deists. They have stood at the top of the origin world for a long time. Although they haven't appeared in the world for a very long, no one dares to suspect their strength and status." "You mean to say that there's some relation between this sword in stone and the deists?" "Precisely. However, if it was only related to the deists, its worth wouldn't be comparable to that of the red god fruit." "Then Master, have you heard of a person named Ren Shenji?" God-flowing wind asked again. "The most qualified artifact refining master in the history of deists? That Ren Shenji?" This time, Lee Yoon-mu snapped his head up in attention. When his gaze fell on the seemingly ordinary weapon, his emotions changed. "Yes, the master refiner has crafted 3 divine weapons in total. This is one of them." Lee Yoon-mu was actually unable to understand what was happening. He had only ransacked the treasury of a third-tier sect, but it somehow contained 4 extremely precious treasures. Apart from the sacrifice refining method, which was somewhat inferior in quality to the others, if any one of the other 3 treasures was revealed to the world, they would immediately incite all the powerhouses to come and fight to obtain them. Yet all of them had been rotting from neglect in the treasury of a third-tier sect. This truly was the funniest joke in the world. "This sword, it will bring me luck or disaster?" Lee Yoon-mu wondered after learning that he'd come into possession of one of the only 3 divine weapons created by the most formidable master refiner. His first thought wasn't one of excitement but one made his heart grow heavy. Deists weren't an ambitious people, but they were the most formidable race in the world. There was no question about it. And Lee Yoon-mu had obtained one of the only 3 divine weapons created by their most formidable artifact refining master. The moment thought about it, his scalp went numb. If he wasn't in his heavenly world, then the appearance of this weapon would have probably caused an incident already. It's difficult to say. Even when my main self was at the peak his strength, it hadn't wanted to provoke the deists. But I'm almost certain that as long as the sword was released in your heavenly world, it would remain safe. A hint of madness appeared in the eyes of God Flowing Wind. But what would be the use of a sword which cannot see the light? I feel like I'm hiding a nuclear warhead, Lee Yoon-mu refuted while shaking his head. Nuclear warhead. Clearly, God Flowing Wind didn't know about the technological weapons on Earth, but he didn't have any intention to ask about them. In a raised voice, he suddenly said, "Master, you shouldn't forget that you are a character who possesses an innate expert armor." Oh! Lee Yoon-mu was startled. How could a divine weapon created by a master refiner disappear? If Master Yoon-mu used his armor's ability to improve, his strength could rise to the next level and his innate expert armor would evolve by 2 levels. It's a possibility, but I may have been a bit too bold with my thought just now. When God Flowing Wind spoke, a hint of hope appeared in his expression. You mean to say that assimilating this divine weapon into my innate expert armor would help it reach the divine grade? Lee Yoon-mu wasn't a fool. He could clearly see through God Flowing Wind's ambitions. Although God Flowing Wind, who was a wisp of soul separated from an ancient god, had become his follower, he had his own thoughts and goals. From beginning to the end, he felt great animosity toward God Undercurrent. Until the day God Undercurrent ceased existing, he wouldn't be whole. His existence would always remain in danger of merging with the main part. Because of that, it was clear that he was making an effort to increase Lee Yoon-mu's strength to the highest extent possible so he could eliminate God Undercurrent who hadn't reached his peak stage yet. Then what was the quickest way to become more formidable without being afraid of consequences? Naturally, nothing could compare to obtaining the assistance of Lee Yoon-mu. Yes, perhaps given his present strength Lee Yoon-mu wouldn't be able to use the divine weapon, but what if he could assimilate it into his innate expert armor? As long as this weapon was refined and became a part of the innate expert armor, its previous properties and presence would be completely erased. Just like that, one of the 3 divine weapons created by the master refiner would vanish without a trace. But can the innate expert armor refine this weapon? Master Yoon-mu, it is the fastest way to evolve to legendary divine innate expert armor. Otherwise, given your present cultivation of first-rank Great Flux Expert, who knows how long it will take you to reach that stage? Lee Yoon-mu had to accept that the other party was extremely crazy and bold to think this way. But he was also excited. Regionally he was quite content with the armor that he had congealed. He was content with the armor he had congealed to begin with, but now there was an opportunity to evolve it right before his eyes. If he became afraid because of deists and missed the opportunity to congeal a divine innate expert armor, he wouldn't have any right to stand among the most powerful people of the original world. His innate expert armor was extremely close to the threshold of the legendary divine grade. If he used one of the 3 divine artifacts created by the master refiner of deists, then maybe there would really be a chance for it to evolve and reach that level. Alright, that legendary divine innate expert armor, I have decided to try to obtain it. Chapter 528, Pangu True Armor. According to God Flowing Wind's words, Lee Yoon-mu's innate expert armor needed to evolve twice before it could transform into the legendary divine innate expert armor. This analysis got in the way of Lee Yoon-mu's original plan. It seemed that he would have to return to the Black Spirit world and use the recently obtained sacrifice refining technique to merge the world space into his innate expert armor. He would actually use the entire Black Spirit world as a resource to upgrade his Azure Dragon expert armor to next level. But before that, there was one important matter which had to be dealt with while he was in Pangu city. After half a day, a large amount of all sorts of human-made cultivation objects suddenly appeared in Pangu city. There were artifacts, all sorts of elixirs and medicine ingredients, treasures, armors, precious metals, and even human cultivation methods. In short, everything that should be there was there. Yoon-mu used Pangu city, which was the only city open to the foreigners by this alien race, to dispose of the enormous harvest obtained from the treasury of Black Spirit Valley. The sudden influx of items disturbed even the administration of Pangu city. Fortunately, because of Yoon-mu's relation to Wang Ren as well as his honest and straightforward manner, no trouble came to find him. After all, he had even taken the initiative to report to Pangu city what he was going to do, so the transactions went without any problems. Pangu city was worthy of being known as the only business center opened by Pangu to the foreigners in the ancient lands of Far East. Apart from humans and Pangu, there were people of many other alien races residing in the city. The harvest displayed by Yoon-mu had relatively valuable objects of Black Spirit Valley, and they quickly attracted the interest of many business groups of other alien races who immediately purchased them. After several days, Yoon-mu had dealt with 60–70% of the treasury of Black Spirit Valley. He had obtained enormous wealth which easily surpassed several tens of thousands of contribution points. And that was when he'd withheld several of the most valuable treasure maps as well as the best quality weapons, armors, spirit ingredients, and other precious objects. If he had sold off the entire treasury of Black Spirit Valley, his profits would have surpassed 100 million contribution points with ease. After counting his wealth, even Yoon-mu let out a deep sigh. It seemed that regardless of what ways he used to make money, it would never compare to eliminating a power and gobbling up its wealth. Naturally, he had to possess formidable strength to accomplish the aforementioned task. The enormity of the harvest had caused him to exclaim in surprise when he'd checked it the first time. After all, it was almost all of the wealth that a third-tier sect had accumulated over many years. If Yoon-mu hadn't hurried over and obstructed them at the most crucial moment, which resulted in the sage flux experts suffering a backlash and perishing, he would have never been able to snatch the sect's treasury in one stroke. When Yoon-mu finally changed the enormous pile of treasure into contribution points after an effort of several days, Wang Ren returned home earlier than usual and excitedly hurried over to him. "Benefactor, good news. In the afternoon, I heard an important piece of information from one of my students. I feared that you might miss this important matter, so I intentionally left the workplace ahead of time to inform you." Although Wang Ren didn't know Yoon-mu's reason for staying in Pangu city, he knew that the young man had worked on selling a lot of goods used by human cultivators. Thus, he assumed that Yoon-mu was a merchant who traded with both humans and the other alien races. He guessed that the youth strived to gain profit from the enormous price difference which stemmed from each alien race specializing in a different thing and thus requiring different things. Earlier in the day, he had happened to hear a piece of information which had accidentally slipped from one of his students. He intuitively felt that Yoon-mu would want it, so he had run back to inform him. What good information? Yoon-mu felt the other party's excitement and quickly went to meet him. He had to accept that this ordinary person had provided him great assistance in Pangu city. It's said that Pangu true armor will be auctioned today in this city. Before Wang Ren had even finished speaking, Yoon-mu's whole body shook. Pangu true armor? Are you certain that it is Pangu true armor? Yoon-mu was truly astonished by the information brought by Wang Ren. There's no mistake. Although I am an ordinary person, Pangu true armor is extremely well known. How could I have heard wrong? You should know that this information came from the higher-ups of Pangu. If my student wasn't the son of the commander of the city guards, it probably would have been impossible to hear about it given our human status. Wang Ren was quite astonished by Yoon-mu's reaction, but still replied with complete certainty. No wonder that I vaguely sensed a lot of formidable experts of other alien races suddenly appearing in the city. Yoon-mu suddenly understood what was happening. He then hastily said, but Pangu true armor is viewed by Pangu as an extremely precious treasure of their race. How could they suddenly decide to sell it to outsiders? Pangu true armor wasn't an ordinary treasure. Because of its unique properties and extreme rarity, each and every one of the Pangu desired to obtain it. If other alien races suddenly encountered Pangu true armor in the wilderness, their heads would be broken and blood would flow. This all came down to the fact that the survivability and defensive capabilities of the person who came in possession of Pangu true armor would increase enormously. Thus, when Yoon-mu heard about the Pangu true armor, it wasn't strange that he reacted in such an intense manner. It was similar to hearing about exactly what he needed just dropping down from the sky. Not long ago, Yoon-mu had faced the headache about where he would have to get another heavenly material to evolve his Azure Dragon expert armor to the next level. According to God Flowing Winds conjunction, if he refined and assimilated the Black Spirit world, the expert armor would definitely evolve by a level. However, that would still leave it a step away from evolving to the legendary Divine Expert Armor. Pangu True Armor was the best choice for evolving his innate Expert Armor to the last step. Given its grade, it would definitely push his Azure Dragon Expert Armor through the final hurdle. But Yoon-mu couldn't understand why Pangu were auctioning this object, which was extremely rare even among them, to the other alien races. Benefactor, it's the other thing I learned today. According to what I heard, this Pangu true armor which requires immediately auction had been obtained from a formidable sage flux expert who had been corrupted and has blackened. This matter is viewed with extreme disdain by the entire race, and they find it absolutely shameful. Thus, Pangu decided to quickly sell off the true armor obtained from a corrupted source to other alien races. While speaking, Wang Ren had a smile on his face. Clearly, he was knowledgeable about the traditions of Pangu. In other words, as long as I can win the auction, I can get my hands on this true armor. Yoon-mu's consciousness shook the moment he realized that it could really happen. Chapter 529, Pangu's Treasure. Yoon-mu hadn't expected to see numerous other alien races in the city all of a sudden. Pangu were from the main Pangu tribe. Ba-Wang alien race came from the 100,000 sunken mountains. Hwa alien race, which rarely stepped into the outside world, was from the abyss of prison forest. There was also Snow alien race which ruled over the vast ice fields as well as Python alien race from the central boundless ocean. Naturally, all of them were among the front 30 alien races of the origin world in terms of strength. Although none of them could compare with Pangu, they were far more formidable than humans individually. This was regardless if one compared them by their bloodline or individual strength. Apart from that, there were many other unknown large and small alien races about which Yoon-mu hadn't heard. They raised the total number of alien races to 38. Even the only other alien race with which Yoon-mu had been involved previously, Hall clan, was also present. Pangu City was a business center which possessed unparalleled number of other alien races. Yoon-mu had obtained a lot of experience and knowledge from it. According to what the system knew, there were more than 1,000 recorded and verified alien races in the boundless origin world. The scene which Yoon-mu encountered in Pangu City was only a shadow of the origin world concentrated in one corner. But even so, he profoundly sensed that humanity wasn't the leader. If the comprehensive strength of humanity wasn't considered, then the strength of an individual of any alien race gathered in the auction house that evening would far surpass it. Regardless of whether it was Ba-Wang, Snow, or Python, the strength of an individual from any alien race was extremely formidable. It was especially so for Ba-Wang. It was said that their bloodline was even more formidable than that of Pangu, let alone speak of any other alien race. As for what the alien races were? As a matter of fact, Yoon-mu himself didn't know the exact definition of the phrase alien race and the differences between the people under it. According to the system's definition, all the alien races could be traced back to two original intelligent life forms in the origin world. To put it crudely, the alien races were the hybrid life forms which originated from the joining of humans with other life forms of the origin world over the span of tens of thousands of years. Naturally, the alien races were formed from formidable ancient gods which had lived in the ancient times. Because of the inheritance of formidable bloodlines, numerous alien races had sprung up in the world. Despite their common human origin, all the developed life forms were considered as alien races. That being said, regardless of the special appearance of the alien races, some human blood flowed in their veins. They were also intelligent life forms with long lives. Their sentiments toward humans were complex, ranging from hatred to yearning. Some hoped to substitute them, and some went as far as wanting to erase humanity. They desired to lose this origin story of theirs in the long river of time, so that it would never be brought to light again. Overall, the majority of the alien races viewed humans with hatred. Naturally, nothing is absolute in the world. There were also a few alien races which looked toward humanity with adoration, considering them as one with their race. Benefactor, the number we received after application is 36. We should enter. Despite repeated requests from Lee Yoon-mu, Wang Ren didn't stop calling him benefactor. Wang Ren hadn't become muddle-headed from Pangu clan's special treatment. He was extremely clear that when all was said and done, he was still a human and an ordinary one at that, someone who belonged to the lowest class. Due to the increased interactions with Lee Yoon-mu in the last couple days, he had only become more aware of the disparity between the two of them. He himself was just an ordinary person, so he had to show his respect for Lee Yoon-mu. When coming to the auction, Lee Yoon-mu had certainly decided to exploit the special privileges received by Wang Ren due to his status. He wanted Wang Ren to appear personally and be prepared to fight for Pangu true armor. Acting in such a manner would give Lee Yoon-mu an enormous advantage over the 40-something alien races. Once Wang Ren participated in the auction, he had the privilege to issue a veto to override his competitors. Only if the other party had the money and were ready to double Wang Ren's price could they even attempt to defeat him. Yes, that was written right. It was the privilege which came with Wang Ren's status as a teacher. Even ordinary Pangu doesn't have such power. Although Lee Yoon-mu had overestimated the privileges which came with Wang Ren's position at first, this piece of information astonished him. Pangu's thirst for knowledge and skills of humans in their cities was reflected in this action. Otherwise, they would have never bestowed such handsome privileges and treatment to an ordinary teacher. Because of this major privilege, Lee Yoon-mu also had the confidence to snatch the Pangu true armor in the competition even when so many alien races had come for it. As the time for the auction drew near, increasingly more people entered the room. Surprisingly though, there wasn't even a single Pangu in the auction. The reason for this was very simple: the Pangu true armor being auctioned had been obtained from a corrupted Pangu sage expert. This was a disgrace for the entire race, otherwise, they wouldn't have ever released their supreme treasure into the world. Thus, the aim of the 40-something alien races present in the room was the same as that of Lee Yoon-mu, which was to get their hands on the Pangu true armor which rarely appeared in the world. The first item in the auction is my race's famous Pangu blade. It was previously used by a high-class crazy Pangu warrior and was nurtured by him for more than 30 years. It has seen the blood of 33 giant beasts, 2 hybrid giant beasts, and countless vicious beasts. Now the bidding officially begins. The lowest price is 30,000 sacred Pangu coins. Each bid must be at least 1,000 sacred Pangu coins higher than the last one. As soon as the first item in the auction was announced, everyone in the auction couldn't help but cry out together in surprise. Pangu blade! No one had expected that the first item in the auction would be of such a high grade. Although it wasn't considered a supreme treasure like Pangu true armor, it was still something that under ordinary circumstances wouldn't be sold to outsiders. It has to be known that it was an extremely vicious weapon. Even Lee Yoon-mu became slightly excited at that moment. Chapter 530, Birdman. The weapon with a basic pattern of Pangu was extremely ferocious. It was announced that it had been nurtured by a bloodthirsty warrior who had used it to kill countless vicious and giant beasts for 30 years. This had led to it gaining 9 patterns, which means that it was extremely close to a sage-level weapon. It would become such once it reached 12 patterns. In any case, the alien races participating in the auction hadn't expected that the first item auctioned by Pangu would surprisingly be such a precious weapon. Ordinary artifact, sage artifact, true artifact. It was only a 9-patterned weapon, so it was still some distance away from the level of a 12-patterned sage weapon, let alone Pangu true armor, which was a supreme treasure of true grade. But everyone also knew that it was an absolutely extraordinary 9-patterned weapon. It had even been wielded by a high-level Pangu warrior who had nurtured it with his blood and sweat for 30 years. Thus, once the weapon was put before the crowd, it immediately attracted the attention of many alien races. After all, everyone in the world knew that apart from possessing formidable bloodline, Pangu were also famed for their patterned weapons. Regardless of whatever was said, the weapon for auction was a lot more formidable than the weapons of their own people. The price of 30,000 sacred Pangu coins was definitely not high. In fact, for human cultivators, it was an extremely low price. Even a great flux expert could purchase it at such a price if they had saved up some money. According to the exchange rate formulated by the Pangu, 30,000 sacred Pangu coins were equivalent to 30,000 tons of grain. A family of 10 or more people from the servant or civilian class might find it hard to pay for 30,000 tons of grain, but human cultivators wouldn't be troubled by such a price. Sure enough, once the 9-patterned weapon appeared, it instantly attracted the bids of countless people. 2 Pangu women came forward while laboriously bringing the 1.8 m long blade flickering with cold light. The next instant, the majority of guests who had originally came for Pangu true armor couldn't help but start bidding, hoping to obtain the rarely seen weapon. 35,000 sacred Pangu coins, 50,000 sacred Pangu coins, 70,000, 130,000, 190,000, 360,000, and 780,000. Within the time it takes for a joss stick to burn, the price of the weapon nourished by a high-level Pangu warrior rose more than 10 times. The bidding price swiftly reached 78,000. But even the astronomical price after the 10-fold increase couldn't stop the alien races from bidding. They continued to raise their paddles one after another, attempting to snatch the weapon. Lee Yoon-mu's heart rate also increased a few times, and he almost couldn't resist joining the competition. After all, even if he didn't need this weapon, he could give it to his followers upon his return. This weapon would definitely increase their destructive power by a few notches. And even if it wasn't useful to his followers, he could give it to the most powerful ape god, which would greatly increase its strength. But after he thought about it, he chose to suppress the urge to join. In the end, he needed all his resources to get his hands on Pangu true armor. Finally, a person from the sound race became the final winner and won the Pangu blade for the price of 1,080,000 sacred Pangu coins. Oh, I hadn't expected people from sound to have also come. When Wang Ren saw this scene, his expression became slightly ugly. Is there some problem with them? In terms of knowledge about alien races of the origin world, Li Yoon-mu was far surpassed by Wang Ren, this ordinary human. After all, once Wang Ren joined Pangu City as a teacher to instruct the young ones, his life had transformed. He received preferential treatment and special privilege while also gaining access to the library of the institute. There, he could examine many records hoarded by the Pangu about the history of the origin world. Li Yoon-mu saw Wang Ren, who was only an ordinary person among humans, in a new light. According to the large amount of data collected in the system's database, sound people didn't possess eye-catching strength among the more than 1,000 races in the origin world. In fact, they were even in the lower layer. Regardless of whether it was their comprehensive or individual strength, both of them were extremely weak. Yet Wang Ren acted rather apprehensive of this case, which astonished Li Yoon-mu. Benefactor might not know this, but these people can manufacture musical instruments with the best sound quality, even if they don't possess great strength. As long as the instrument is manufactured by them, it would fetch an astronomical price in any corner of the world. That is why it could be said that they are walking treasuries. They are extremely wealthy. While explaining it, Wang Ren sighed deeply. As if influenced, Lee Yoon-mu's gaze fell on the few sound clansmen standing by the side of the Pangu blade. After a careful observation, his brows creased. At first glance, the two women fit perfectly with the data gathered by the system. They were extremely weak. There couldn't be any comparison with the formidable Pangu, for the two women from Sound weren't much stronger than ordinary humans. Even with the system's secret scan, Lee Yoon-mu still found it hard to believe that neither of them possessed any cultivation. Their individual strength was tantamount to a physical flux expert possessing a strength of 15 oxen. Lee Yoon-mu was instantly amazed by it. God only knew how a race which was extremely weak but adept at excavating wealth managed to exist without trouble among the countless life forms in the origin world. Wang Ren seemed to have already sensed Lee Yoon-mu's suspicion, for he added, "Benefactor mustn't think of them as someone weak and easily bullied. In reality, there aren't many who would dare to touch them. Even the hosts of this auction Pangu may not be brave enough to covet their wealth." Why is that? Lee Yoon-mu's brows jumped. It's very simple, they are one of the alien races given asylum by the deists. As long as a person's brain isn't filled with melon seeds, they won't think about laying a hand on sound people. Benefactor should pay attention to that bird man standing near one of the women, Wang Ren said softly. The presence of that alien race person was extremely mediocre. If Wang Ren hadn't pointed him out, Lee Yoon-mu might have ignored him completely. But because of this exact reason, Lee Yoon-mu suddenly let out a deep sigh. It was truly strange that he had completely ignored this bird man previously.